Very much. I'd like very much to welcome Stefano Boeri back as a visitor to the AA. He came last term for the diploma open juries, and we're very pleased to see him here back so soon. Stefano is an architect who teaches urban design in Venice and in Mendrisio. And he's also a visiting professor at the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam. In addition to which, he writes extensively. He's a regular contributor to the Italian newspaper Il Sole 24 Ore, and also practices as an architect. He has recently completed work includes a geothermal plant in Tuscany, which was selected to represent Italy in the recent exhibition New Trends in Architecture, which was held in Tokyo, Porto, and Rotterdam. And also, in terms of his, aside from working as a journalist, he's also contributed to a series of theoretical books, which include recently Mutations, which also included contributions from Rem Koolhaas and Sanford Quinter, and also this year a book titled Multiplicity, Uncertain States of Europe. Stefano, thanks very much for coming, and we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So I think we have not too much time, and I will start immediately. My English is quite bad, so I'm really sorry if my lecture in some points will be not enough clear. Please tell me, and I will try to maybe go slower and try to come back to some points, on some points. So what I'd like to do tonight is to advance some arguments against one of the main rhetoric we have now in the, let me say, in the contemporary thought. And it's a rhetoric, or we could say from another point of view, it's a new utopia, which has been produced not simply in the architectural field or in the field of urban studies. It's really a wide, very diffuse myth. And this rhetoric is trying to convince us that the contemporary world is more or less nowadays interconnected, which is more or less totally crossed by flows of information, flows of capitals, flows of goods, flows of people. And this image, which is of course in this, I am now presenting it in a very schematic way, but it's a point of view about the contemporary reality which has some strong argument. And I think it has also, let me say, produced some very interesting specific survey about the contemporary reality from different perspectives. I think, for instance, we could now quote three main texts. One is a text written by Manuel Castells, that probably you know very well. It's really a very complex work about the net. And net in this text, is not simply a text, it's a series of, it says, is really a metaphor of our society. The net, its logic, its dynamics is really seen by Manuel Castells like a metaphor of the possible interconnection of the entire planet. The second contribute that I have considered really important is a contribute of a sociologist, of Bauman, that you probably know. And Bauman is suggesting, from another point of view, that the contemporary reality, specifically in the Western countries, specifically in European countries, can be observed, can be read nowadays like a sort of composed by a certain liquid substance. The relation between institutions, the relation between the subjects, the relation between the different networks of people that are now, let me say, governing the European environment could be observed nowadays in a different way. What Bauman is suggesting is that there is a really a growing liquidity which is characterizing our contemporary societies. And if I can add another contribute that I have considered quite interesting, but at the same time I consider it a little bit critical, it's the contribute made by a geographer, quite new geographer, which is Saskia Sassen, that you probably know quite well, which is a closer contribute to our architectural point of view. And what Saskia Sassen is also suggesting is that the contemporary world, and specifically the, let me say, the economical system of our Western society is nowadays interconnected thanks to the presence of some global cities, as you probably know. And the hierarchy determined by the presence of these global cities is really creating a sort of planetary network of interest and of goods flows. In a certain sense, let me say that these three contributes are, from different points of view, really proposing us an image of our contemporary condition, of our, let me say, modernity, which is very strong. And more or less, they are all underlining the fact that the main aspect of our contemporary society is exactly this kind of liquidity interconnection, this really possibility of the entire planet to be crossed by the same flows of goods, information, capital, and so on. Honestly, I think that we should start to criticize this approach. I really think that from the architectural point of view, or better, from our point of view as architects, we have nowadays the tools and the reason, and I think also the arguments, to advance a critique toward this myth, towards this diffuse utopian observation of what the world is working. If you take care of how these three contributes, or in more, or more generally, this position about, let me say, the prevalence of flows in our contemporary societies, we could consider that these three contributes have two common features. They propose two common, let me say, positions. The first is a more or less idea that from an aggregate view, from a synoptic view, because this free text has many other texts which are dealing with globalization in a certain sense, are texts which are producing an image of the physical space, of the mineral space, like a sort of smooth surface. And the second feature, which is more or less characterizing this kind of contributes, is that in all these contributes, the local dimension of the space, let me say the local sphere of the physical environment, is more or less annihilated, is more or less rubbing out, is more or less cancelled, avoided. Or, to be more precise, sometimes the local dimension, the local space, is considered, because it's working like let me say, a friction, a presence of resistance to the strong and pervasive articulation of flows. Or it is considered, for instance, by Saskia Sassen mainly, has something which could be and should be observed because it's acting as a condenser, is acting as a place able to synthesize, to attract flows, to attract these flooding dynamics which are surrounding and crossing the entire world. Or maybe sometimes they are also considering a local place only because they are, let me say, particularities of a whole environment. They are observed like examples, like parts. Well, I, in a certain sense, think that our position as architects nowadays should be totally different. I think that local space is an incredible jewel case, is an incredible casket of clues that could help us to understand much better what is happening in the huge physical environment which is surrounding us. I really believe that local space are nowadays more than ever working as sensor able sometimes to register and to text the change, to text the innovation which are happening in our societies. In a certain sense, local space is like an eye of a needle. It's something where innovation should and must and is obliged to pass, in any case. And it's really sometimes the unique way we have to observe the change in our societies. It's the unique way in which the change is coming visible, suddenly visible in their complex characters, in the complex features. And finally, I think that local space could be observed like a sort of device. It is a device because it's really not simply a composition of physical things. It's not simply a context for social behaviors. It's not simply a place where we project our symbolic image, but is in a certain sense all these things together, and at the same time is something which is repeating some pattern, some model of change, some ways of change. This simply to tell you that I think that probably if we miss something, if we are really, we should have a social utility in our work as research on urban condition nowadays, it is exactly the fact that we should, in a certain sense, be able to reevaluate this sphere, to reevaluate the importance, let me say, the strategic role that the observation of local space could play in the explanation of our contemporary societies, not simply in the explanation of our physical environments. I really think that space is a fantastic metaphor to explain societies, to explain social behavior, and nowadays this metaphor is quite evident. I think that our capacity to sample, get closer, observe, and represent and interpret what's happening locally, it's more and more and more important. So what I'd like to do tonight is simply to show you some research and some projects. Also the term project is not something which I really like a lot, but which are more or less, let me say, confirming this kind of approach. I will start with the research that I have done, or better, we have done. When I say we, because I'm a part of a research agency or research group called Multiplicity, who was founded, I don't remember exactly, 5 or 6 years ago. It's a group of, it's a quite interdisciplinary group of people, architects, artists, researchers, photographers, sociologists, anthropologists, which are more or less trying to, as I told you before, sustain, to let me say, to advance the hypothesis that the observation of local conditions, of physical conditions, is a good way to propose it, to advance aggregate interpretation of our societies. And the first work that I'd like to show is research we have done about Europe. I will be very schematic presenting it. But before this, I like simply to tell you that normally I really don't like to put together research and projects, research and design. And this is quite strange, I understand, because sometimes it's let me say, we are used to connect these two spheres. We are used to imagine that research on urban condition is a good guarantee, is a good condition to produce a good design product or result. We are used to imagine that sometimes design is a good way to explore the urban conditions, for instance. But I think that both these two spheres are produced by our proximity as architects, proximity to the local dimension of our environment. And this is really probably the real common nature of these two spheres. Proximity is one of the, let me say, peculiarity of our professional role. Is probably the most important peculiarity of our role as architects and as researchers. But I have also to tell you that, in my opinion, these two spheres should be kept separated. I think that from one side, research is really an inclusive attitude. When we do research, we are used to explore, to, let me say, open the future. We are used to put in our work more and more possibilities. We are used to gather, to be generous, to gather material, to gather opinions, to gather witnesses. We are really enlarging the field of things, of ideas, of materials that we are using in order to go ahead in our exploration of the local space. So research is substantially inclusive. Design is substantially exclusive, as we all know. Design is something which asks you to be selective, more and more selective. We have to select material, we have to select things, we have to select ideas. And it's something which, in a certain sense, is oblige you or to, at a certain point, to select at the point to simply determine if there's a unique and close and settled physical configuration. So what I simply think is that this fertile schizophrenia that we could manage to show, to, let me say, to represent with our individual presence as architect, when we try to host together these two spheres without adulterating their relation, without, I am coming from Italy. Italy in the 70s and in the 60s has been probably in the architectural field the country where every kind of possible connection between urban analysis and design, urban analysis and project has been produced, as we know very well. You know Aldo Rossi, you know Vittorio Gregotti, you know Tafuri. You know that we have produced a strong thought trying to convince us that there is a very important and, let me say, necessary connection between two spheres. But from my point of view, nowadays we should start exactly from the opposite. We should start accepting the difference, the substantial difference of these two spheres, and also, let me say, trying to host them together without combining necessarily them, without trying to have a deductive relation between these two spheres, but hosting them, hosting these two spheres together, hosting their conflictual presence within us. And this is for me one of the most, let me say, goal. I'm very interested in the schizophrenia that sometimes is characterized in the architectural life. I'm really interested in the also psychoanalytic effects that sometimes we can see in the daily life of the most interesting contemporary architects. And I really think that this schizophrenia is something that we should conserve in a certain sense. Sorry, this is the first thing that I'd like to show you. And it's a research about Europe. As we know very well, it's quite difficult. We were asked from an institution, French institution, for the 2000 celebration to do a research about city in Europe. So, city, what is a city nowadays? We know very well that this name has many other names that we normally use in our practice, like public space or periphery or center, are names which are flowing on the reality, names which are really weak, incapable to catch the real things that we see around us. And one of the names is city. The other name is Europe. Europe is really a very uncertain entity nowadays. What is Europe? If we follow the main politics produced by European Community, for instance, we could say we have 6, 7, 8, 9 different Europes. Not simply in terms of geographical perimeters, but also in terms of, let me say, centers, geography of centers. In terms of, if you follow, I don't know, the Euro politics, we have a certain Europe. If we follow nowadays the politics connected with immigration troubles, we could, and with Schengen agreement, we are now probably designing and describing a totally different Europe. And if we follow the defense politics, as we have seen recently, we are describing another totally different Europe. So Europe is really an uncertain condition, but we know very well that in a certain sense Europe has always been an uncertain condition. And at the same time, what is really interesting for me is that this uncertainty, it's also connected with the fact that Europe has become, in the last decades, a huge, unique, hyper-dense urban environment. This is not a fake. We could really say that from a certain point of view, from a geographical point of view, from a demographical point of view, from the point of view of our daily experience as European travelers, of our daily life travel experience, Europe is something which is really close to a unique urban settlement, a unique urban configuration. So I think that from certain point of view, these two aspects, the uncertainty about the profile, the perimeter, the identity, the center, the geography of Europe, and the knowledge that Europe, the awareness that Europe is now considered, we could consider Europe like a unique urban entity, are, let me say, working together, and are probably two aspects of the same difficulty, of the same weakness. Why? Because these two aspects are more or less connected with the fact that if we really want to continue to observe and to interpret Europe starting from an aggregate point of view, starting from a synoptic point of view, we are condemned to, let me say, to produce this sort of paradox. So Europe is, from a certain point of view, evidently a unique thing, but at the same time is something which we cannot describe as a unique entity. The fact for me, the matter, is that probably if we really want nowadays to describe what Europe is, if we want really to describe what Europe could become, if we want to understand how we could act within this environment in political terms, let me say in architectural terms, we should probably totally change our perspective. We should probably totally change in terms of try to enter in this problematic field from a different point of view. And this point of view is exactly this idea to work on local space, on the local sphere. Not consider local space like an example, like a part of a wall, like a space where a space of friction, or like a space where we could observe emergencies, architectural emergencies, or something like this, but because local space is a device. Because local space is a device of change. Because European space is a local device, and if we understand it, we could probably understand better what is happening in Europe nowadays, not simply in the physical environment, and we could probably tell something also what is happening in our societies. So that's what we're showing you is a net of researchers that we asked to be part of this research on Europe. It's a large group of quite 70 people coming from 15 different countries, and the idea was really to sample. I think that the idea of sampling, for me, it's one of the most problematic and interesting and intriguing, let me say, task we have nowadays in the field of research on urban conditions. Sample is necessary. Sample is necessary when you have lost a clear geography of what you want to study. Sampling is necessary when you have lost a hierarchy, a strong hierarchy that helps you to imagine a sequence of, let me say, of steps in your research activity. Sampling is necessary when you don't know exactly what you are observing. Like an archaeologist when has to describe a city which is totally covered by ground, and he has simply, what he can do is simply to do a sort of vertical excavation. And the idea is to coordinate several vertical excavation and then to compare the result of each one of these and to try to, let me say, to produce a process of accumulation of knowledge, a gradual accumulation of knowledge, gradual superimposition of knowledge. So more or less what we have tried to do with the use on certain states of Europe research is exactly to start simply sampling. So we decided to sample some places, some local space in Europe, some local environments in Europe, where in the interpretation of the local research group, something of new was happening. And we immediately understood, and this is probably one of the hypotheses and the result of the research, that this new was really in a quite evident way not directly produced by architecture and not directly produced by urban public politics. These new dynamics were more or less produced by, let me say, self-organized processes. Places where the promoters and the user were the same people. Places where the new relation between social behavior and physical environment were really produced by self-organized dynamics. And this was probably one of the most, also for me, surprising result of this first step of the research. I think I have not the time here to, of course, show you everything, but what I'd like to do is simply to show, I have not the voice, unfortunately, oh yeah. This is one of the cases. We started with selecting something like we started selecting something like 70 case studies, then we select them because we had to produce an exhibition, and this is something that I'd like to underline later. So there is something of really, you can say, not clear and also a little bit bizarre and strange and perverse in the relation between research and exhibition. Of course, when we do research, you have to be rigorous, you have to have a, let me say, to work on the long period of time. You cannot pretend to, but I'll explain you later. This is we are in Paris, in the 3e arrondissement, and this is one of the cases we have collected for with the users. So this is a housing district built in the 70s by the French state for, let me say, a public of middle-class employers. And at the beginning of the 80s, after what's happened, that the official inhabitants of this place more or less never came here. And this space remained void for many years, was totally reoccupied by a new community of Chinese people, of immigrants, that started to really rehabit and, let me say, to transfigurate the character and the nature of this incredible building. This is more or less a model of the rigid vertical layout what we know as a product of the modern architecture. I can say in the tower, the flats, in the first floor platform, the shopping activities, and the underground parking areas. What is happening, starting from the beginning of the 80s, is that these new communities that are now much more heterogeneous and complex have really redesigned the connection between these two different activities. If in the flats, in the tower, you now can find not simply flats, but also workshop, temples, restaurants, place of work that change every week in order to avoid the police and in order to avoid to produce noise for the neighbors. In the underground place, which is there are 4th floor of underground place, we can find a sort of incredible complex heterogeneous bazaar, like a marketplace with different goods at different depth. And the platform is used like a sort of public place, so no shopping. And what I like simply to tell you, showing you only this case, is that this is a typical case of what is happening in the urban condition in Europe. We know it very well because it's something which happens around us. But I think we should start observing with a certain attention such processes. We should start to observe with a certain attention this process of change, which are self-organized, which are at the same time producing some really innovative dynamics in the relation between social behavior and physical environment. And with this, something which is also suggests something to our architectural, let me say, techniques. In terms, for instance, of showing us like a rigid, a strong, a fixed, a settled configuration can be able to be readapted, can be able to be reused, sometimes more than a flexible, adaptive building. So that's simply to tell you that this research is a research which started sampling many different cases. And in order to do this, we... sorry, what's happening here? There is a video and it doesn't start. Okay, sorry. This video doesn't start. Simply to tell you that probably comparing these case studies, comparing this sort of vertical excavation, this vertical biopsies on the European body, we could have a first result. Or may also, let me say, we could have a first schematic representation of what Europe is nowadays. And this representation is, first, the fact that Europe is really nowadays an archipelago of differences. Is really a place of the world where we could find the world in terms that we could find in Europe any kind of possible social and cultural and physical landscape. Europe is hosting parts of North Africa, Europe is hosting parts of North America, Europe is hosting parts in terms of physical environment which is close to what is happening in part of the Asian continent. Is really a place where it's evident that a lot of different world environments are working together. So from a certain point of view, this capacity of sample Europe could give us the idea that Europe is simply an archipelago of, an eclectic archipelago of different environments. And that is totally crazy to imagine to find common features, common characters in this archipelago, because it's really, let me say, a kaleidoscope. But from another point of view, going deeper, trying to compare better the result of these case studies, I think we could tell something about this possible common character that we can find everywhere in Europe, in Belgrade or in Paris, in some part of the Spain coast or in Norway, in some part of, let me say, of the Sweden cities or in Sicily. And I think to be really strongly schematic, and that's something that we are now publishing in the catalog, in the book of this research, we could probably advance the hypothesis that Europe is a place, is a local device, which is characterized by four main aspects. The first is quite evident, we know it very well, it's density. European urban condition is hyperdense. Hyperdense in terms of things, of built things, hyperdense in terms of networks, hyperdense in terms of flows. And we could, as we have done in this research, but as many people is doing nowadays, we could compare many representation of Europe, and in all that we'll find probably an incredible density of things. And from this point of view, the density remains one of the main characters of our European space. Then there is the second aspect, which is probably a little bit more complex. We know it very well as architects, because we know very well that the history of architecture in Europe is not the evolution of unique thought, it's not a evolution of few traditions. It has always been a movement of, let me say, metabolization of what is external. History of architecture, but also the growth, the evolution of the European cities is an evolution which has, let me say, always used parts, experience, tradition, which were born abroad. And in a certain sense, the capacity of architectural of the history of European architecture to import, to reinterpret, and to re-explore sometimes this external tradition is something which is very important in our culture. Then there is a third possible character that we can find everywhere. And this third character is exactly this fact that, there is a last possible character, the fourth, what we could find in Europe, I think, in the physical European environment. And this last aspect is that probably Europe is a place where the decision-making system is incredibly complex, where we always find a multitude of subjects that pretend to decide in terms of change on the physical environment. I normally use a term that is not probably very precise, but is a unique term that I consider useful to explain this concept, which is the term polyarchy. Polyarchy is a way to, let me say, to substantiate the fact that Europe everywhere is a place of negotiation, is a place where every choice has to be decided together with many subjects. So this is, as we know very well, something which is trouble and create troubles in the normal decision-making process, but is also something which is, let me say, guaranteeing an equivalent relation between the multitude of subjects which are acting in the physical environment. So let me say that from a certain point of view, density, superimposition, metabolization of what is other, and polyarchy are four characters of contemporary urban space in Europe. Maybe if you keep only one of these, we are not describing Europe, we could describe many other places of the world, but if we keep together these four features, we are describing Europe. We are describing not Europe as a whole, we are describing a certain way of change, a certain local device of change. And that's probably simply is not a result, nothing more than a confirm or method, let me say, a confirm of a method. I really think that this is quite important. It's quite important nowadays to see, to observe this fact. To go ahead, two other things I'd like to tell you about this research. One is that probably this urban device, this local device, is in a phase of strong transition. What is changing? From our point of view as architects, I think there is a very important thing which is changing. That is connected with the relation between the principle of variation and the principle of differentiation. Let me explain better what I'd like to tell you. This is Barcelona, we know it very well. This is a Cerdà, let me say, texture grid. But we know that the European city, for centuries, has grown following certain rules, a certain syntax. And this syntax was a syntax that more or less was orienting the evolution, following a dynamic which was a dynamic, let me say, determining additions of new homogeneous parts. The history, the geography of many European cities is not so different from the history of many European cities. I mean, when you keep a car and you start driving from the center of our town towards the periphery, we are really, let me say, redoing a sort of journey in the time, a sort of trip, traveling, crossing the time. We are starting from the older part of the city, and then we enter in a Renaissance part, for instance. Then at a certain point, with a very strong, let me say, passage, we enter in a new part, which is maybe the 19th century texture, and then we arrive in the public housing districts, and then we arrive in the industrial district, and so on and so on. But this is simply to tell you that the European city has been composed by some huge homogeneous part. And its nature, its syntax, it's still this. The compact city in Europe is composed by different, strong, huge homogeneous part. Of course, with some exception, with some hybridization, with some contamination. But we could, not simply mapping a city, but also crossing a city with our body, fill this strong sort of composition. So the principle of differentiation in the history of historical European cities and of modern European cities is working, defining some huge homogeneous part. And the differentiation is between these parts, so between the Renaissance part and the medieval part, between the medieval part and the Roman let me see, remains, between the Renaissance part and the 19th century texture and so on. And the variation, the principle for variation is normally working within each one of these parts, is working within, for instance, the incredible rules, evolutive rules, which is contained in the Cerdà project, or is working within the, let me say, the rules which has produced also public housing and districts in the last century. I think that nowadays we are really in a phase of transition, also because these two principles, the principle of differentiation and the principle of variation, are changing their work. If we really try to get closer to any one of these, let me say, huge diffuse molecular conurbation which are surrounding all, or let me say, most of the European contemporary city, this is the Milan region, we find a totally different action of these two principles. The principle of differentiation no longer works separating and distincting huge homogeneous parts, but is working really at the scale of the buildings. It's working distinguishing the single family house from the shopping mall, distinguishing the shopping mall from the portion of the historical center, distinguishing the portion of the historical center from the workshop, distinguishing the workshop from the other single family house. So in a certain sense, the syntax of the contemporary settlement is something which has no connection with the traditional syntax of our city. And also the principle of variation is working in a totally different way, because the principle of variation is connecting things, typologies, which are not contiguous, which are not one close to the other. So when we work with variation, we are more and more used nowadays to sample That's another reason I consider the sample activity quite important nowadays. We are obliged to select things which are not contiguous. And more we are obliged to, let me say, to jump connecting things which are not contiguous. So what I would like to tell you, that probably this change in the syntax of this is Athens, of the contemporary city in Europe, of the evolution, is really something of structural, of substantial. It's something which has many effects also in our professional practice as architects, because it's something which is changing the way of change of the space, and it's reflecting the way of change of the social behavior of our societies. I think that more and more we are used to observe that these, let me say, huge upheavals which are changing the European context are composed by a multitude of tremors, by a multitude of individual acts, by a multitude of small, solitary, lonely, but amassed tremors. And sometimes, like happened in the Bradesistic movement, these upheavals can be described only if we were able to see the molecular nature that are characterizing their dynamic. And from another point of view, I think that the European context, the urban European device, is something which is, let me say, showing us following some pattern of change. It's strange. It's like a sort of incredibly rich vocabulary which is not able to produce a grammar enough rich to represent it. Because really, the grammar of the contemporary city, the grammar that is evident in the suburban environment, but it is all, let me say, less evident but not less stronger in the center, in the more compact, the more dense part of our city, that grammar is really working with a molecular nature, because the number of subjects which are nowadays able to change the space has incredibly grown in the last decades. The number of individuals, of groups, of professional clans that is nowadays able to intervene in the space, intervenes in that polyarchic system, decision-making system that I tried to explain you before, trying to change locally, to produce individual tremors in the space, has incredibly grown in the last decades. And this is really a change in the genetic code of our city. It's not simply a change which is, let me say, characterized in the periphery of our attention. It's something which is changing everything around us. I have no time to tell you that we are also working about this pattern. So how can we describe this pattern of change? Is it true that it's not an infinite list of patterns? Is it true that we could produce a list of these patterns and how we could represent them? Because to represent change in real time is something which is not usual for our, let me say, work as architects. So that's something that I'd like probably to discuss another time. What time is it? Could you do some? No, now I'd like to change, because otherwise I have no time. This is a project I have done 3 years ago. We were invited by the Rotterdam municipality to develop a project for a suburban area, which is a huge island in the south of Rotterdam. Totally, now it's quite totally empty. It's only, let me say, hosting 6 or 7 villages, and it's really a very, very, let me say, beautiful agricultural environment. This is more or less the island. It's an island because, as we know, you know how Netherlands was built, so you know that the polders were, let me say, a sequence of steps fill up the sea. So the polders are the process of occupation of the sea. So in a certain sense, Netherlands, the history of Holland is a history of colonization of the liquid continent. And this is one of the places where this history is more evident. The dikes that were, let me say, following the growth of the physical environment are nowadays streets. The canals are, let me say, remembering the presence of the water. But this is a really nowadays an agricultural environment which has many, let me say, which hosts many clues of its old past. So the question was, how can we urbanize this environment? Because as you know, with the VNEX project in Holland the last year, the state planned, Holland is probably the last country in Europe where there is a really deterministic way of urban planification, still. And they decided to build a lot of new housing districts for young people, for young family, for poor people, for immigrants, following, as we probably know, also a very, very rigid typology of housing, more or less a single-family house and towers. So they asked us and a group of urban plan architects and landscape designer to, let me say, to propose a methodology to urbanize this environment. In a certain sense, this is an image of how is this environment nowadays. And we were really totally submerged by this research about Europe. We were we have just finished to do a long study about the Milanese region, about this sort of totally chaotic mess of tremors, which is changing our southern Europe environment. So we were invited to see, to tell something about this environment, which is in a certain sense exactly the opposite. Another place, like to go in another planet. But we tried to, let me say, to experiment and to translate or to export here also the result of our research. So we first tried to tell that probably Oksewaard, which is this suburban environment in the south of Rotterdam, is not so different from many other places which now are, you know what is the blue banana? Sociologists and geographers call the blue banana this sort of molecular, continuous, urban, low-density environment, which is connecting, let me say, Milan and London in a certain sense. But I think that what is true in this representation is that nowadays it's possible to habit, to live in a countryside, but being connected, being totally wired in the main infrastructural networks. And that Oksewaard probably has this possibility. That was simply the first step. And then we decide to try to get closer to the question of how to redesign and to propose a new urbanization. And finally we arrived, that's on the right side, here you see this is a section of a dike with a street built after the dike. And we decide to propose a city, a model of a city, a pattern of a city, composed by 11 filaments. And we decide to suggest that each one of these filaments should be built along these streets, so along the dikes that have been transformed in streets. And they decide that what we could do in this place was not to determine the future, to have the arrogance, the presumption to really predict what could happen there. We tried to, of course, is a demonstrative project. We tried to experiment a sort of undeterministic urbanism, an urbanism which could deal with uncertainty, an urbanism which could deal with the unpredictable effects produced by a multitude of individual tremors in the physical environment. So with these 11 filaments are more or less like 11 DNA, 11 genetic code, which are simply telling the extension, the maximum extension of the urban environment, the specific combination of housing and other activities which are proposing in each one of these 11 filaments, which is simply more or less showing a possible process of evolution of each one of these 11 filaments, but nothing more. So what I think is interesting, or for me was interesting in this project, was exactly what we have decided to not explicitate. Was exactly the voids which are in this project. We arrived finally to propose a pattern of these filaments. The idea to have for each filament a different combination of functions and activities is connected with the idea to produce a unique city and not simply 11 differentiated villages. And in a certain sense, we tried also to represent all the possible unpredictable conditions and constraints that could be appear in the future of the space. Constraints connected with politics, constraints connected with the change in the local condition of people, constraints connected with some extraterritorial choice, like the fact that some infrastructure should be built in the next years, but nothing nowadays it's quite difficult to know where exactly they will be built, and so on and so on. So, in a certain sense, the idea was to deal with this, to recognize this sort of substantial uncertainty, and to imagine imagine what? Imagine the fact that probably following our genetic codes, we could arrive to produce some different environment. Maybe one like this, or like this, or like this, or like many others. And all this environment will have a certain specific rule. For instance, the fact that all the agricultural field should be maintained. For instance, the fact that everything should be built along the streets, along the dikes. For instance, all the specific rules that we have proposed for each one of the filament, but we don't want to propose an aggregate design, let me say comprehensive design of the future of this environment. We simply tried to propose the idea that what we were proposing was to put there some device of change, or better, 11 devices of change. And these devices of change should be able to react, to change, to absorb, to go ahead, following the rules, but being able also to, let me say, to deal with the impracticable results of the multitude of subjects which will operate in that environment. So in a certain sense, that was for me an important experience, because it was probably the first time that I tried to let me say, to associate something that I have understood from our research activity and try to translate it, not in a very deductive way, but with a jump, also a conceptual jump, in a professional occasion of work. And there are many other things that I'd like to tell you about this project, but I think that this is also an attempt to see if it was possible to propose some patterns of in terms of decision-making system in the production of this place, but that's something that I'd like maybe to explain another time. I'd like to get closer to the end of this lecture. This is a research we are doing now, is a research about the proliferation of borders that are characterizing contemporary societies. In another sense, is another way to advance critics toward this myth of fluidity, this myth of liquidity of the contemporary world. I think that it's quite evident that there is a sort of dark side of this myth. And the dark side of this myth is something which we could observe with a certain precision, and which is exactly more or less could be described like an incredible and unpredictable proliferation of border devices, but not border in terms of lines or borders in terms of walls, borders in terms of, how could we say, thickening, vibrant thickening of the space. And this vibrant thickenings of the space is really the result of flows sometimes, is really the way in which local space are reacting to this incredible movement of flows. We tried to, let me say, to describe this proliferation, and this proliferation is something that we should describe, and we are trying to describe also in this case, choosing a series of local places and trying to get closer, not simply immediately producing an aggregate interpretation, but comparing an aggregate interpretation with local biopsies of how our physical environment is working. So in a certain sense, this also is a research which is connected with this use experience. But after some discussion, we are now trying to deal with the theme with some very peculiar constraints. So the first one is that we decide to get closer to a very, very controversial and difficult and conflictual social and physical environment, which is the territory, or let me say the region which is hosting the Israel state and the Palestinian territories. We are now working with a network of people, of Israeli researchers and Palestinian researchers, and the idea is to try to work on this space in order to, let me say, to use this space like a sort of laboratory. We could say probably nowadays that that place is a place where we could find, in a hyperdense way, all the typologies of borders, all the typologies of border divides that we find normally around us. We could find them in Korea or in Colombia or in Nicosia or in Spain. So in a certain sense, I think that this idea to observe the Israeli and Palestinian context like a laboratory it's in itself something of quite useful and interesting. This is a case study we are now following. We have decided to produce some biopsies in this environment, and one of these biopsies is a sort of reading of a parallel trip of two taxi drivers. One is an Israeli taxi driver, and the other one is a Palestinian taxi drivers, which are crossing the same environment, starting from the same point and arriving at the same point. And on one side, the Israeli taxi driver is following a sort of highway, come si dice, sopraelevata, flying highway, which is connecting the columns village, which are, let me say, quite present in the occupied territories, is really a 20 minutes continuous experience. The other trip is a 4 hours and 50 minutes experience, and this is an experience which is a continuous stop and go movement, because every time you have to, let me say, to deal with check-in, with checkpoint, you have to deal with walls, you have to deal with immaterial borders. So this is simply one of the possible way to detect locally how the border devices are working. But this video that we will show in Berlin in June and also at the Venice Biennale is a comparison of these two trips. Now I can show you only one of these, and this comparison will be done also with the help of a map. The map will be a map, a lot of chronological map, who will, let me say, represent the movement of these two taxi drivers, of these two, let me say, sensors in the local space, and trying to compare the different heterogeneity of border devices that both are encountering along their parcours, along their journey. Because the thing is exactly this, that probably also in this case, borders are in a certain sense multiple. Borders are in a certain sense quite heterogeneous. We could probably do a list, an incredible list of all the borders we know, also in our ordinary life. But from another point of view, we could say that borders are, let me say, a device which is following some very strong patterns. We have borders which work like enclave, and we know very well how they work. There are borders which work like funnels. They, let me say, attract and orient flows of people, of goods, like happening along the Mediterranean coast, and they put these flows within some trajectories. There are borders which work following, let me say, let me use a metaphor, like pipe, boarding which are cylindrical surfaces, or there are boarding which work like membranes, or borders which work like ghost limb, borders which are physically disappeared, but they continue to conditionate the space. So I think that something that we could do using our proximity and our capacity to detect the local space, to observe traces, clues in the local space, is also in this case to produce a list of devices. Again, a list of devices. Again, a list of ways of change connected with the border nature. So that's probably a very long thing, but this is the Israeli experience, which is totally different. Oh, sorry. But okay, you can imagine this sort of camera car, continuous camera car, going. But in a certain sense, quite interesting. So it's really, please take care. We really decide to not, let me say, follow our prejudgment or our strong political positions, because we had. And also, if we are working with people coming from different cultural traditions, we have very clear political orientation, and we have clear judgments about what's happening in that environment. But we decided, in any case, to work, like I said, we say, space detectives, so without starting with a prejudgment. And this was one of the way we tried to put together to observation and to... Okay, then we are working on another map, which will be shown in Venice and Berlin. And it's a map in which we are trying to put in evidence this capacity of this context to work as a laboratory. So all the world is there. All the world is in Israel. All the world is in Palestine. And we probably could see how all these different border devices could be represented in the Israeli and Palestinian context, but at the same time represented everywhere in the world. We are producing with the Berlage Institute students this matrix, which is a matrix showing exactly like, for instance, these 6 urban devices that you see here on the left, fences or enclave, pipe, funnel, folding, sponge, are connected with region of the world where they are mainly determining the border conditions, and how, let me say, every one of these urban devices has a certain nature, has a certain capacity to conditionate and to host the flows, and so on and so on. Okay, this is our other image. What we are also asking to the group of research and of artists that are connected with us in this project is to produce for the opening of the Venice Biennale a parallel trip, parallel journey, one from Berlin, where we have the installation at the Kunstwerk, and the other from Jerusalem, where we have an installation in an art gallery, and to detect along this path all the border devices, all the border that they encounter along their trips. And this is something that will show in real time. This is a public call that we are now producing, and that I will show you and send you. And these are some of the... Okay. Maybe, what time is it? ¿Qué horas son? Okay, I have 5 minutes when the game is starting. Okay, so I simply like to show you probably two last things that you probably know. This is a research project installation, and installation is part of our research and design activity, but we have produced it for Documenta 11 in Kassel last July, and is now a process, an installation which is growing and moving. Has been in Vienna and Rotterdam, and and it should go in Paris in July. And this installation was also in this case, starting from a biopsy, a local biopsy. There, in that place, Christmas night in 1996, a small wood boat with 340 clandestines coming from Sri Lanka and Pakistan sank. It was 3 a.m. of the morning, and the weather was very bad, storm and so on. And the two boats, one was a huge boat with a lot of immigrants, but they are refugees, not clandestine, because as you know in Sri Lanka, when you are 14 you have to escape, because otherwise you are obliged to decide if you want to fight with the guerrillas or to fight with the local police. So the unique possibility you have is to escape. And so these two boats, one was full of clandestines, the other one, it was a small boat used to at 20 kilometers from the Sicilian coast to transport people from the bigger boat to the coast. The two boats was okay, and the small one immediately suddenly sank, and 208 people died, and for weeks, for months, the relatives and the survivors asked the Italian authorities to, let me say, to try to check what was happening in that part of the sea, because of course there are a lot of witnesses. And the Italian authorities, but also the authorities of Malta, also the Greek authorities, refused to consider this fact. For months, for years, they answered that nothing was happening. And this is incredibly sad. This is incredibly surprising, also because for months and for years, the Sicilian fishermen, which are inhabiting in the southern coast of Sicily, found in the nets remains of the body of the people who died. And there are many incredible and tragic and dramatic history of how the fishermen found parts and remains and entire parts or small parts of the body of the victims of this tragedy. But nevertheless, nothing happened. Only 5 years after, thanks to the fact that one fisherman decided to show to the police, or better, to show to the journalist in Rome, the ID, the identity card of a young Sri Lanka immigrant, and decided to rent a boat together with the fisherman and a sort of submarine camera who was able to observe what really was happening in that part of the world. And this is the video, a selection of the video that this camera was doing. So here we are 103 meters under the level of the sea, and this camera is a wireless camera controlled by the people which are on the fisherman boat, and you see what they found, and they found group of dresses, okay, and finally they found also the boat. So only 1 year ago, 1 year and a few months ago, this journalist and this fisherman were able to, let me say, to demonstrate this tragedy, in a certain sense also to accuse the, let me say, the incredibly bad behavior of Italian authorities. But was a scandal, was an international scandal for some days. Then, after these days, everything has continued to stay in the same domain, in the same silence, in the same, let me say, noising silence. It's a really an incredible noising silence, because everybody knew, but nobody tried to verify, to check if this tragedy was real. And remember, this is the most important tragedy happening in the Mediterranean basin after the Second World War. So what we tried to, for us, this nowadays, what you are seeing there is still in this condition, so nothing has changed. And what we decided to do in Documenta was to mettre en scène, to put in evidence this tragedy, and we did it with following certain methodology. In one room we had collected 9 witnesses of all the people, let me say, all the categories of people who were involved in the tragedy. So this is the commandante, the chief who was driving the huge boat. This is one of the survivors, for instance. Then there is a fisherman, then there is the Italian policeman, then there is a journalist, and so and so and so. So one room was like a sort of polyphonic mess of direct opinions about what's happened there. On the other room, we have two huge screens. On one screen, you had the map that I showed you before, which is a map showing the satellite image of the exact night in which the sunk happened. So was Christmas night 1996, and is a satellite image, which is more or less like a sort of time zooming, saying, well, we are there. It happened at that point. On the other screen, we have put the image taped by the submarine camera. And this is, from another point of view, a sort of physical zoom. So we are going closer to what was happening in that place, and in a certain sense, which is still there. Okay, so now I have no time to show this, but that's simply to tell you that this installation, this is some images of the installation we have done in the version of the castle version, is a way to, let me say, to represent not simply an event, because of course this was a tragic event, and in our aim was really to help to, let me say, to underline, to represent this tragedy. But was also a way to go ahead trying to produce, to be more rigorous in the way we are representing, exhibiting the result of our research. Because this is also research. And the research is dealing with the new nature of the Mediterranean basin. The title of this exhibition installation is Solid Sea, and this title is connected with the fact that we are more and more convinced that the Mediterranean basin that has been for centuries and decades described like a sort of a cradle of cultures, a place where tradition, religion, experiences could let me say, hybridize, could combine their experiences, is becoming more and more in the last decades a sort of rigid continent. We can observe in this part of our world a solidification of the trajectory of the flows which are crossing the sea, because it's true that the sea is crossed by an incredible, let me say, number of dense and intense flows. You know what's happening because it blocks every image. Okay, but I really think that these trajectories are becoming more and more rigid. When you enter nowadays using a funnel, remember this is one of the urban devices that we are studying, using a funnel, when you enter in this basin, in this liquid or this solid continent, you should, let me say, acquire a very schematic identity. You could be a fisherman, you could be a sailor, you could be a soldier, you could be a tourist, or you could be a clandestine. But what's happening is that when you enter in this identity, when you acquire this identity, you enter in a fixed route. You enter in a pipe, and you have no possibility to exchange your experience, your culture, your knowledge within this trip. Only when you arrive on the other side of the pipe, maybe you could reacquire the complex, unstable, multiple identity that you are used to host. So that's something that we should observe with a certain attention. That near us, there is a place like this, like the Mediterranean basin, which has been centuries considered like a sort of place of meeting, a meeting place, sort of, let me see, metaphor of what could be a public space, is becoming a rigid and dramatically rigid continent. Okay, maybe I have no time. I simply wanted to finish with some consideration about architecture and showing you a project we have done recently. Why I'm showing this? Because I was here for the critics, and I should say that there is probably the last critic that I like to advance toward this myth of fluidity. And this critique is connected with the fact that architecture sometimes, or sometimes more and more, I could say, in the contemporary condition, is trying to convince us that what we create in terms of physical environment can adapt itself to the change, to the social change. We are more and more submerged by blobs, bodies which are evolving, bodies which are morphing themselves, able to predict, able to absorb, able to adapt, able to change. So I really don't believe in this. I don't believe in this. I don't believe in the fact that architecture could be a caricature of social dynamics. I believe that social dynamics is something which we should consider with attention. We cannot predict, and that we could and we should try to orient. But in order to orient this dynamics, we should work with an architecture which should be, in my opinion, stable. Stable in terms of meanings, stable in terms of identity, stable also in terms of, let me say, when I say stable, I don't think that it cannot be moved, but it has to be stable. Sorry, this is simply one of the last things we have done, which is an expiring architecture, which is an architecture is destined to it's a geothermal plant in Tuscany, and the electric public company asked us to do a remake of a machine who they wanted to build in Tuscany, and finally we decided to accept, but with let me say re-discussing the question. So we decided to to give back an identity to this machine, and that's exactly what we have done, but using the curtain, which is a pre-oxidized steel, is a material that you know very well, which is a material which has a certain usura, weather, so it has a time life, is an expiring material. And that's exactly because this building has an I'm tired now, has a very determined life, only 25 years. So this was a way to let me say, to produce a building which is quite strong and stable and physically evident, but also following the fact that it will die soon. Let me say, okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Stefano says he's happy to take a couple of questions, so yeah, we'll take 2 or 3 questions.
Not more, because that's the other building we are now building there. Okay, but because there is a football match starting now, sorry. No, really, please.
I'm interested in the last bit about the stable architecture to respond to the dynamic society. How would you argue with that statement?
Well, I have nothing to add. It's exactly what I've told you. I don't believe in this, let me say, wave or fashionist attitude to produce figures which are able to adapt themselves to any kind of condition. So I don't believe that really that's the matter of contemporary architecture. what we observe around us is more a process of change which is produced by, let me say, additions or reconfigurations, by, let I tell you, changes which are really sudden superimpositions of text. And I think we should learn a little bit from what is happening around us. And we should probably also be more modest from a certain point of view, knowing that an architecture which is born with a stable meaning, with a stable identity, probably will be more capable to accept unpredictable changes in its future. But, okay, that's more or less what I do.
How is the Rotterdam project, or south of Rotterdam, how is that project stable?
No, that Rotterdam project was stable simply in the, let me say, in the rules that we are proposing to the municipality. Municipality has accepted our proposal with the other proposals, and now nothing has happened. So the process hasn't been implemented. So nothing happened. We had recently a contact with the municipality, and they told us that they are very interested to experiment in a part of that contest our proposal, but that's all. So there is not a concrete evolution of that project. But that project for me was more really a sort of an experiment than realistic, but it could become realistic. I'm sure that it could become realistic, producing a sort of second step. Please.
I welcome your interest in local aspect of urban design. I think this is really time we focus on to such issues. I am surprised such you should think as antithetical, as two positions in conflict. On the one hand, the aspect of flows, which maybe we should push aside, and on the other, it's a local aspect of urban design, which we should concentrate on. It seems to me that in the examples which you have shown, whether it is Israel or others, also Place d'Italie in Paris, those are very striking instances of places where global aspects and local aspects are coming together. And why are you thinking of those two models, global or local, as alternatives?
I don't think in them as alternatives. Maybe I was not clear, but I think that global flows not simply are conditioning local spaces. I think that global flows are not simply hosted by local places or by the local sphere. They are sometimes totally redesigned, transfigured, determined by local places. And sometimes local places are generating transnational flows. So what I simply want to underline is that we cannot avoid to observe the other side of global processes. And this is exactly what we should do as architects. And this is exactly what we should do using our attitude to be closer to the physical environment. So I'm very schematic, but I really don't want to give you the idea that I'm canceling the dimension of flows, or that I am canceling the question of globalization. Not at all. I'm simply saying that we should put our attention more in the other side of the same processes, observing from our point of view how the physical space is reacting and interacting with these flows.
Okay, Stefano, thanks very much. I think
Thank
we'll
you
leave
very
it
much.
leave it at that.